So my name is Todd Savage, and clearly I'm a school psychologist by training. I've shared with people earlier today just a little bit more about my background. I was born and raised in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I'm a first-generation college student. I had a little bit of a rough childhood, and it was my fifth grade teacher, Mrs. Karen Altstedt, that really took me under her wings. And I shared earlier that if you know anything about the resiliency literature, it's replete with information that for children in difficult situations, all it takes is one important adult in their life to make a world of difference. And Mrs. Karen Altstedt was certainly that person for me. She got me on a career trajectory where I was thinking about college. I went to the University of Minnesota, and I intended to go to become a kindergarten teacher. But by 3 years into my degree, I had no ed credits and a bunch of psych credits, so I finished out a psychology degree. And if you know anything about psychology, it is still the most popular major in the United States in 2019, and we hit the top of the pay and the glamour scale pretty quickly with an undergraduate degree in psychology. So I worked out there for a couple years and decided I needed to do something more, but I wasn't sure what to do. And it was a friend one day who said she was going to go check out a school psychology program. Would I go with her to be supportive? And I'm like, well, what's school psychology? And she's like, why don't you sit in on the meeting and you can hear about what it is too. So it was clear to me within a few minutes of this meeting that this was the right fit for me. I had this interest in education, and I had this background in psychology, and this felt like the perfect marriage for me. So it's that old movie audition story that somebody going to audition for a part, they take a buddy, and it's the buddy that gets the part, and that's what happened in this case. I got into school psychology, and my dear friend got into the culinary arts, and the rest is history. So I did all my grad work at the University of Kentucky. I spent about 9 or 10 years there. I did my internship in the Omaha Public Schools, and Angie McKinney and I got to have the same internship supervisor. She was just a little bit ahead of me. And then I worked in New Mexico, at New Mexico State for several years before my current position at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, which is, I live in the Twin Cities, and it is just inside the border of Wisconsin, about 20 minutes away. Throughout my career, I have focused around school safety and crisis prevention, preparedness intervention, suicide work, behavior threat assessment and management work, social justice issues in the field, as well as LGBTQ+ student issues with an emphasis in gender diversity. So that's a little bit about me professionally. Personally, I have a 14-year-old son who is plowing his way through 9th grade, and he dazzles his parents every day. And I love to cook, I love to travel. I'm going to Africa this coming summer, and I'm super excited about that. And before I was in graduate school, I was a professional dancer, but that is 30 years in my past. So that's a little bit about me. We're going on an hour-and-a-half journey here talking about school-based threat assessment and management information. For purposes of full disclosure, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Melissa Reeves. This presentation I'm giving is based on her work, and Dr. Scott Wadaszewski and I are colleagues at River Falls, and we've been given permission to take her work to adapt it, and you're getting highlights of a 3-hour workshop, a 3 to 4 hour workshop today. I do want to stress that you're not going to be leaving here today fully able to go out and conduct a behavior threat assessment and management process. You're getting some good, solid foundational information and skills or knowledge, but of course you're going to need further training and opportunities to practice and be supervised, and you're not actually getting a protocol. There's a protocol that we often, when we do the 3 to 4 hour presentation, give, because people could potentially leave that, work with the protocol a little bit and get some hands-on experience. So again, you're getting some good information, some good knowledge, but it would require you to continue your professional development, to get more information, to get some practice and some supervision around this. So I just wanted to stress that. I'm happy to entertain questions as we go throughout, and if I can't answer the questions or I don't have it, I will be sure to get it and get the answers to you in some way, shape, or form. Okay? Are there any questions about me, my background, or anything before we start going through our time together here? All right, well, thank you very much. Again, please feel free to interject or ask questions as we go through, and I'll do my best to answer them. So in terms of our objectives, I'm here to increase your awareness around behavior threat assessment and management in schools, to help either enrich your knowledge base or help you construct a knowledge base in this regard. And I'll talk about highlights of the elements of a school-based process. Again, I'm giving you highlights versus you're not going to leave here with any direct skills per se. And it was everything we do in the field, it should be tied to the NASP practice model. And this presentation has been set up to align with preventative and responsive services there. So you see that next to the red arrow. And you're also getting NASP approved CPD for this, an hour and a half of NASP approved CPD. So we just want to make sure that it's always anchored to our practice model. I was sharing with people earlier, if you're not aware, NASP every 10 years on the decade updates its standards. And so we have the new standards that will be coming out next year. The standards are in the area of the practice model, graduate education, the credentialing, the NCSP, and the ethical standards will all be updated as of next year. So we've seen the first drafts of all of them. They're in the process of being revised. We will approve them sometime next year, and they will go into effect next July. So I was telling people earlier that the NASP practice model, what I've seen, there's maybe some slight differences, but what you see on the screen, it's going to look very familiar. It hasn't changed a great deal. All right, so let's talk about behavior threat assessment and management. What you see on the screen right now are the 5 missions of crisis management that are put out there by the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education has given guidance to public schools in the country that in doing school safety and crisis-related work, that we should address these 5 missions. I'm not sure why they call them missions, but that's their term. We should be looking at prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. You notice as you listen to that it's a fairly comprehensive approach to this issue. Sometimes I've noticed in some schools they focus on one minute element, and sometimes the bigger picture gets lost. But so the bigger picture being is that we in schools should be looking at these 5 areas in our school safety and crisis response work, everything from prevention to the recovery phase. And so with that in mind, behavior threat assessment and management fits within this bigger picture in a number of ways. From a preventative or preparedness standpoint, under the level of mitigation, we could get a handle on known risk. So we've got some high flyers or people on our radar screens or things like that. We can go through this process to get a handle of known risks, to manage it and try to prevent it from getting to the point where violence might occur. Or it could also be at the response level that a threat has been made and we need to go and investigate what kind of threat this is and develop a plan for managing it so that it doesn't get to the level of actually being carried out. So I just wanted to give you the bigger picture purview. For those of you who've been through Prepare or will go through Prepare, the School Safety and Crisis Response curriculum, it is a comprehensive school-based approach to this topic that addresses these 5 missions. All right, and so just be aware of that. If you've already taken Prepare or will be taking it, that everything we're doing at NASP is trying to fit within these 5 missions. All right, so a bit of information from a background data perspective with school-associated violence. Schools, we want to stress, are relatively safe. Schools are some of the safest places in America. Now, I realize that that sometimes sounds interesting given all the focus that has occurred in the media around some things like school shootings and things like that. And I don't want to de-emphasize the tragedy of school shootings. They are horrific issues, and we don't want them from happening in the first place, but they're very tragic when they do. But the image many people have is that schools are violent, horrible places, and in general the data do not play that out. In those instances where something does happen, of course it's horrific, but in general schools are safe. 83% of violence against youth ages 15 to 18 happens outside of school. All right, so this is happening more in communities or homes or things like that versus school campuses. Overall, violent crimes have fallen over the last couple decades, though we're wondering if there maybe is a little bit of an uptick. So we'd have to look at the data to see in the next couple years if there is has been an uptick. But up until the last couple years, violence overall has gone down in the United States. And less than 1% of youth homicides occur at school. So again, we want to send the message that schools are some of the safest places out there. Now, it doesn't mean, our antennae should be up. We should be doing everything we can to be preventative and responsive and securing schools and making positive school climates and being prepared for what's probable first and getting to what's possible as we can. What do I mean by that statement? Well, as you can imagine, with the school shootings that have occurred in the media and stuff like that, a lot of schools have really focused in on the physical safety of schools. and perhaps in some ways have overemphasized physical safety. And I can appreciate why that reaction's there. There's community pressure for that to happen. Schools, it's just, it's tangible. But we should be focused on what's probable first and getting to what's possible when we can in our prevention and preparedness phase. So for those, how many have been in the, that I can see here in the room, how many of you have been through Prepare? All right, so there's a few hands have gone up. If you remember Prepare 1, the Prevention and Preparedness Workshop, there's a vulnerability assessment included in that. A vulnerability assessment gives you an opportunity to look at your district and or your building and get a sense as to where you're already doing things well, where things are already safe, secure, you've got good social, emotional, and other things in place, as well as some good physical security. And it also exposes those areas that have yet to be addressed and helps give you a timeline as to when to address those issues. Well, something that comes out of that vulnerability assessment, it exposes those things that you are more probably going to experience or anticipate, and helps you make sure that you're solid there and that you can get to those things that are possible when you can. So school shootings are certainly possible. We've seen evidence of it in the media, but they are still relatively rare. So I don't want to make it sound like we shouldn't do anything about them, but we want to make sure that that we get to that type of thing when we feel like we've got the things that are probable under control first. So what's an example of this at play? I live in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. Earthquakes are possible there, but not probable. If we did a lot of emphasis or focus on preparing for earthquakes at the expense of other things that are more probable, fires, tornadoes, things like that, we'd be missing the big picture. We want to make sure that we have those things that are probable under control first, and then maybe we can get to those things that are possible as we can. So make sure we've got good tornado stuff under control, good fire prevention and stuff under control, some of the things that we expect in the Twin Cities or in Minnesota, and get to the things that are probable when we can, including a school shooting. So I just wanted to put that out there, that we've got to focus on the probable versus possible. And I think it's coming up, but I'll also state it here, a preview of coming attractions, is this balance between physical safety and psychological security. And that's another Prepare kind of approach, that we should be striving in our work around school safety and crisis measures around balancing physical safety with psychological security. Again, a lot of places are overemphasizing or so hyper-focused on the physical side that they sometimes forget or overlook the psychological security. The two work in tandem with one another. So with psychological safety, the basis for that really is rooted in positive school climates. And what are the elements that we have been shown in the research to contribute to positive school climates? Well, it's things like social emotional learning initiatives, safe and secure schools, evaluating an emphasis on diversity, inclusion, social justice, promoting good internal resiliency, promoting good external resiliency, positive behavior interventions and supports, and school connectedness, amongst other things, including homeschool collaboration. I forgot that one. Now, the research doesn't say that it's 10% social emotional learning and emphasizing 20% PBS or whatever like that. It's just some coming together of all of these initiatives that have been shown to contribute to a positive school climate. And it's really going to be based on at the local level. So every school's different, every community's different. So what that balance might be is going to look a little bit different. But my personal bias, my personal perspective is that school connectedness, I don't know if it trumps everything, but to me, school connectedness is what rises to the top. We could have a solid evidence-informed curriculum, a talented teacher core, good rigorous intervention or instructional strategies, good interventions, all these other contributions to a positive school climate. But if we don't have good relationships amongst the people in those buildings, all that other stuff goes to the wayside. That I think the foundation of a positive school climate rests on school connectedness. One way I got at this when I was a practitioner, around school connectedness was we would gather every adult with a building, associated with the building together, including our kitchen staff, our custodians, our bus drivers, our paras, and everyone else in addition to our teachers and administrators and school-based mental health staff. And we put up a picture of every single kid in that building in a large space like a gym or a cafeteria or something like that. And we'd have all the adults break out by roles. So teachers over here, administrators over there, bus drivers there, and so on and so forth. And we gave every one of those groups a different set of colored stickers. And we said, go through the room and put a sticker by every kid you can name by name and tell us a couple personal facts about that kid. And so the adults dutifully went through the room and would do that, and they would leave, and the administration and the school-based mental health staff would stay behind, and we'd be doing a data analysis on the spot. Now, we could do a number of data analyses, but there were two big ones that we were focused on. And I'm sure you're guessing we were looking at numbers of stickers, and we were looking for trends in colors. So with numbers of stickers, of course, we're looking for those kids who have 0 or few stickers next to their names. Though that's a school connectedness problem, we got to get to those kiddos ASAP. But I stress that we can't also just look at the kid with 1,000 stickers next to the name and wipe our brows and think that we're scot-free or home free. These are adults' perceptions of connectedness. And those perceptions may not match kids' perceptions of connectedness. So we see a kid with 1,000 stickers, we think, yay, they appear to be connected. But that child may not experience the same level of connectedness that we perceive. So we also have to get students' perceptions of connectedness, which are very important to compare and contrast between adult perceptions and their perceptions. And there are a number of measures out there that you could use to get kids' perceptions of school connectedness. So CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, has a bunch of school connectedness rating scales or forms that you can use to get kids' perspective, okay? So I just want to stress that we got to get both. So but back to the adults. We were looking for numbers or stickers. And then we were also looking for trends in colors. Which groups of adults were connected to which groups of kids? Because we want to use that information to help us when we need to go in and build more connectedness and things like that. We don't want to overlook any adults in this process. I mentioned up front that I'd had a little bit of a rough childhood. Without going into all the details, by high school, I was trying to get out of home as early as possible to avoid things there. So I would leave for school about 2 hours early. And there was also, I did that because I was a walker and I was on a very busy street to get to school. And the buses going by were, it was a bad experience of kids bullying outside the windows as they're going by. So to avoid issues at home and to avoid that form of bullying, I just left early and would get to the school and wait. Now, again, I mentioned I'm from Minnesota, so you can imagine in January, it's 20 below zero, and you're waiting outside of a building for an hour and a half or so, it gets really cold. My first year as a freshman, within about a month or so of winter, there was a custodian that had that area of the building where I was waiting outside the door. And he started noticing me standing there. And so after a week or so, he came to the door and without asking why I was there that early, he was just, hey, I see you here every day and, you look cold and that type of thing. How about, could I just meet you at this door every day at this time, and I will let you in and get you set up in the band room if you want, and you could do homework and I'll go about my business. What do you think about that? And that happened for all 4 years of my high school experience, to the point that no other adult in that building ever knew that that took place or that that was happening. So we've got adults connected to kids in ways we're not even aware of. And we want to learn about those connections, and we want to use the leverage of every adult who might be connected in ways to kids that some of us are not. So again, I'm trying to emphasize this notion that relationships are important, and I believe that they're the essential foundation on which positive school climate rests. We need those other initiatives, but I think trumping everything else is this notion of connectedness. Kids to adults, adults to kids, adults to adults, school to community, community to school. We want to make sure that we're looking at all of those areas of connectedness, because they are going to help us create safer climates. Hopefully they will help us in the prevention of violence as well as suicide. That's not the focus of today. But those relationships can help us in a number of ways, and I'll highlight more specifically about the connectedness issue here in just a bit. I feel like the big talking head at the moment. Any comments, questions, or needs for clarification from anyone at this point? Seeing none in the room. Dr. McKinney, anything out there? All right, thank you. All right, so what about school mass shootings? So I said here to you that violent crimes overall in the United States have gone down up until the last several years. Shootings had been going down, and school shootings, individuals shootings have gone down through the decades. But what's been on the rise in the last few years are mass shootings. So while there have been fewer individual shootings, we're seeing an uptick in mass shootings, meaning a larger number of people are being killed with fewer incidences. So a mass shooting, as you see here, is defined as when 4 or more are killed, excluding the shooter. This is from the government, the Secret Service and FBI. So that's how they're defining a mass shooting. 4 or more people killed, excluding the shooter. So school mass shooting deaths have steadily increased in the United States over the past few years. So that you see here by decade, in the 1950s there were no documented mass killings in schools. In 1960s, the same thing. I don't know where the 70s are, but the 80s, there were 12 documented mass shootings that occurred in schools. In the 1990s, 36, and between 2000 and 2018, there were roughly 66 documented mass shootings, and those, have only increased over the last year. So that's what's been on the uptick, is that while there have been fewer shootings, those that do occur are killing more people. All right? So, as we think about behavior threat assessment and management, some general considerations to keep in mind. So there are several models out there around this topic in terms of how to go about behavior threat assessment and management. There are many more than the 3 on the screen, but these are kind of the 3 big go-tos and the ones that have been used most in schools. So the Secret Service model, the Virginia model, and the Dallas model. The Virginia model, the Secret Service model came about through the years that we want to focus on facts, not fears. And so this is why reporting is extremely important from a Secret Service perspective, that we should have reporting mechanisms in place, which in schools, we want those that are anonymous. We want anonymous reporting systems. But again, this is why relationships are so important. This is, we want kids to see adults as trusted people. And if they see, hear, or know something, that they can seek out trusted adults in the building when they are made aware of something that might be brewing. So that's, again, relationships help us in the sense of getting kids to directly report when they see, hear, or know something. And we should also have anonymous systems in place for those who don't feel comfortable seeking out adults. With the Secret Service model, data are collected from a variety of sources. We're doing this through interviews, we're looking at records, we're doing other types of things that way. And a corroboration of information from multiple sources is very important in this process. And so you see here a resource to help you learn more about the Secret Service model that was just updated a year ago summer from the government. And so the links are hot here. You should be able to access these resources. The Virginia model is most closely associated with Dr. Dewey Cornell with the University of Virginia. That's why it happens to be called the Virginia model. Dr. Cornell has been a go-to person around this topic for a number of years. And his work is focused specifically, it's taking it and focusing it on schools. And so something unique about the Virginia model has been this notion of transient versus substantive threats. And the reason this is important is sometimes in some schools we've seen zero tolerance policies or any type of whim when it comes to a violent threat. It goes towards suspension or expulsion. Well, the Virginia model has been focused that we should be distinguishing between transient threats and substantive threats. And the research has shown that roughly 80% of violent threats are more transient in nature versus substantive. If we treated every one of these threats equally and just zero tolerance, 80% of these might be manageable and keep kids in school, keep schools safe, and keep kids engaged versus just this, let's just get everybody out of here, which Is that doing anybody any good? Is that doing the kid any good? Is it doing society any good? Things like that. So again, the data have been pretty consistent that roughly 80% of threats have been more transient in nature. A kid didn't know how else to express their frustration, or just made a statement that they have no intent of following through on it. They were just expressing frustration in the moment, versus those kids who do have some type of substance behind their threat. Access to means, a plan, things like that. So the Virginia model, you want to still focus on facts, you still want to get data from a variety of sources, you still want to corroborate information, and you're also distinguishing between those threats that appear to be transient versus substantive, because you're going to handle them differently. You're going to develop some type of behavior or some type of intervention plan in those transient cases to address, find more appropriate ways to express frustration or deal with frustration or things like that, versus those substantive threats. You might go down a very different road in those cases. The Virginia model you see here is recognized by the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs and Practices. Sometimes there's been some confusion with the Virginia model. Sometimes you'll hear people say it's the only evidence-informed behavior threat assessment and management process, and that's not truly accurate. The Secret Service model, the Dallas model, other models do have some research support behind them. The Virginia model is the only one listed on this registry. So I just want to make sure that you hear that message loudly and clearly, that it's not the only evidence or research-based process out there. It's the only one that happens to be on that particular registry. But there are other evidence-informed research-based models out there, and I'm giving you exposure to some of them here. And then the Dallas model, it's again not terribly different, but it helps schools systematically assess threats to determine the likelihood of a student following through. I guess it's kind of that transient versus substantive kind of thing. And it also provides direction for appropriate intervention. So it smacks of, it's got the same flavor as the Secret Service model and the Virginia model. There are just some nuances to it, okay? So these are the three big models that are looked to in schools when doing this type of work. And if you are charged with helping develop a process or helping augment a process that already exists, I would encourage you to look at if something's already in place, does it align with one of these three models? If not, try to find the one that fits and again, make it more in line with that. Or if you're developing one from scratch, I would invite you to go to one of these three and find the one that you think fits best locally. Okay? Any comments, questions, or needs for clarification about the models? Nothing out there, Dr. McKinney? All right. Defining threat. Now, this is going to come primarily from Dewey Cornell's work. So you see over on your left-hand side, according to Cornell, a defining threat is any expression of intent to harm someone, is how threat's being defined here. And so communication of a threat varies. It could be directly spoken. Somebody verbalizes it. It could be in social media. Somebody posts something in a gaming platform or in various types of social media or things like that. It could be heard through a third party. It might come through behaviorally. You're aware of somebody who's carrying weapons, things like that. And it could be specific, and it could be veiled. And so for those of you looking at the screen, a specific threat might be something along the lines of, I'm going to kill you, versus a veiled threat might be something like watch your back or something like that. So we want to make sure that we're teaching adults how to look for various signs, both specific as well as veiled. And this is why it's also important to communicate with kids about what they should be looking for, listening for, looking for, or if they're in social media or gaming platforms, what might stand out in there as people are talking to each other or posting things like that. So what if a threat happens? So students usually make threats when they are frustrated and face a problem or situation they cannot solve. You see that's a direct quote here from Dewey Cornell. So I'll restate it. Students usually make threats when they are frustrated and face a problem or situation they cannot resolve. So I want you to take 60 seconds. For those of you in the room, turn to your neighbors and talk about why is this point important. And for those of you at a distance, if you're with others, you might want to turn to them and have the same conversation or think about this on your own. So 60 seconds, why is this quote important to consider? And let's come back together as a large group. So for those folks here in the room, I have direct access to you right here. As you reflected on this statement, what stood out to you as to why this is important? Yeah? They may not have other skills or see other ways of dealing with a frustrating situation, okay? So it may be a skills deficit, and we want to intervene and perhaps build some skills to prevent them from even getting to this point, okay? What else stood out to you in your conversations around this quote? Why it's important to consider in this process? Yes? That in many of these cases, these are more transient in nature. Again, there's no real intent to follow through. There's no means, there's no plans, and nothing like that. Again, they don't know how else to communicate their frustration. They may not have the skills to manage the situation in the moment. So again, this is why this is called behavior threat assessment and management. We're going to go in and look, is this transient versus substantive? In those transient cases, we're going to develop an intervention plan that will help take all that information into account and help intervene with this kid to get them on a better track that way. Anything else that came out of your conversation different from what has already been expressed?
We would not get to this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a 51-year-old abstract thinking educated adult, and I found myself saying something like, I'm so frustrated I could just kick somebody right now. I don't mean that. But I also know, that what I'm doing. But with kids, they may not have those skills or that understanding. And this, again, if we can just get them on a track to express themselves differently or find other more appropriate means to communicate or to express what's going on for them, it would well behoove us to work from an educational standpoint versus doing a punitive type of approach. There's a place for disciplinary action or punitive approaches for sure, but probably in 80% of the cases, we could go a different route. With threats themselves, you see here on the screen, threats of violence are relatively common. In many cases, threats are more transient than anything else. It's just reinforcing what I've already stressed to this point. Actual violence in schools is relatively rare or somewhat rare, but systematic threat assessment can help teams decide what's real versus what's not and make more informed decisions about how we're going to handle the situation as a result. So what is behavior threat assessment management? What I'm going to, from here on out, call BTAM, behavior threat assessment and management. It's a process that's meant to prevent or to mitigate school violence, prevent it from occurring in the first place, or to, if we hear or see or experience some expression of it, to mitigate it. It's data-based, evidence-informed. The goal here is to interrupt pathways to violence, and it involves intervention or management, just not behavioral consequences. So in terms of some of the cornerstones, it focuses on actions, communications, verbalizations, some type of specific circumstances when an intent that might suggest an intent to commit an act of violence and access to means to carry out that particular threat. Again, the more substantive forms. It's based on facts rather than characteristics, traits, profiles. The Secret Service, the FBI have all put out there that profiling does not work. That we shouldn't be profiling. I mean, we shouldn't be doing this, period, right? And that when it comes to violence, that profiles have not shown to be helpful or accurate or to provide any substantive guidance on what to do. They're usually concerned if a student poses a threat versus have they actually made one. Again, many students might express frustration and it comes off as a violent threat. We shouldn't just discipline because that kid because they've said something or posted something. What's the intent behind that threat? Again, you're still getting that distinction between is this transient versus substantive. And it's conducted in a team-based format that relies on the expertise of the team members assembled. We'll get a bit into this a bit more deeply here in a little bit, but again, we want to stress team-based, and you want a variety of roles represented on that team. An administrator, a school-based mental health person, I'm biased in the direction of a school psychologist, but maybe a school resource officer, and I'll tell you why I'm stressing maybe later on. It's good to probably have a general education teacher, a special education representative, and you can decide whoever else might be appropriate to populate that team. But this process should not rest on any one person's shoulders, and for a variety of reasons. And the team-based format helps mitigate a lot of concerns. So again, I want to stress teaming, and we'll get through this as we go deeper into the presentation. And you see there under that last bullet point, vital, it includes developing an intervention and management plan. The emphasis is not on delivering discipline or punishment primarily. There may be a room for discipline or punishment if it's more of a substantive a threat. But in 80% of these cases, it's going to be more of a intervention plan to prevent that from ever getting to that level. All right, so how do we go about this? Well, first it starts with prevention. Some preventative measures help us to prevent from even getting to the point where a threat is made. So you see there, staff development and training. This is like gatekeeper training, that we should be training all adults associated with a building, and we shouldn't overlook our substitute pool. And I'm assuming in Indiana that educators still need professional development to maintain licensure and things like that. In Wisconsin, it's changed, but in most other states, it's still in place. And that includes your substitute pool. They have to, in order to maintain their license, they're probably going to have to engage in professional development. So make sure that you're doing this type of training with all staff, all adults with a building, including your substitute pool. What is violence, what to look for, this notion of now they're not making the decisions about what's transient versus substantive, but they know what to look for and they know what the reporting mechanisms are so that they have concerns, they know where to go with this information. All school staff members are responsible for recognizing warning signs and knowing the referral procedures I just stated. And then you see here on the bottom, staff members know all reporting procedures for a variety of things that might occur in school. Bullying, harassment, suicide concerns, violence or dangerous concerns, child abuse and neglect, substance use, sexual assault, and cyberbullying and other types of concerns. We should be training, again, school staff and other adults associated with schools in how to recognize all of these areas and where to go with reporting when they have concerns about these issues as they arise. So we need to make sure that all adults with a building are trained in these areas. And it's not stated here, but there's also a level where we need to work with students on what to recognize and where to go with this information. That'll come up a little bit later. So again, we're still thinking about a preventative mindset here at the moment. And I've already stressed this notion of this balance between physical safety and psychological security. We could have a school with a 12-foot concrete wall around it, 3 feet thick, with razor wire at their top and a sniper at every corner. Most people are going to look at that as probably a fairly physically safe school from certain types of threats. But what do you think that type of image is doing for the people looking at it from the outside and for those working inside the school? What do you think that's doing to psychological security or safety? It may not be helping a heck of a lot. It might actually be instilling fear in people, that there's constant heightened awareness or hypervigilance that threats right around the corner. I'm not saying we shouldn't be vigilant, but when we overemphasize physical safety, it can actually be counterproductive to why it's put in place in the first place, okay? So again, we want to make sure that we're balancing physical safety and psychological safety. The psychological safety piece, again, being the school climate stuff that I've already talked about. I'm aware of a school where they're kicking butt at the psychological safety side of the house, but at the expense of the physical safety. It happens to be an independent school, K through 12 school, where they've just created this enormous sense of community. Kids to adults, adults to kids, building to community, community to building. Lots of adult involvement, lots of families are involved. They're moving through the building at all times of the day. Kids open the doors when they see somebody coming. It's polite, it's courteous, things like that. Multiple doors to the building are open throughout the day historically. I love the sense of community that school has created and that sense of trust. But I'm also fearful for that building because there's multiple entry points that are open, and we don't want kids necessarily opening doors for adults as they're approaching the building. We want to make sure that that there are multiple ways to, layers that they have to go through to get in and stuff like that. So again, we need to find this balance between the physical safety and psychological security. With all the adults moving through that building at all hours of the day, nobody signs in or signs out. Nobody's wearing badges, and they're moving throughout all areas of the building. We don't know who should and shouldn't be in that building, what adults are there. So again, we want to make sure that we've got some of the physical safety things in place to support the psychological security and vice versa. All right? So physical security, what might some of this look like? Well, again, for those of you who've been through Prepare, this comes through the vulnerability assessment. You see things like parking. Is visitor parking visibly marked? Is it physically marked? And can that area be monitored from inside the building? Are there multiple layers that are required to get inside a building? You know, old construction from, let's say, pre-1990-ish, sometimes there was just a single door that got you into a building. A lot of new construction now has like, an ante-lobby. You have to get into the lobby, then you have to get buzzed into the building, and often now you have to be funneled through the office and you have to sign in or things like that. I do a lot of school visits for practicum and internship supervision, and many schools in the Twin Cities now have, once you get into the ante-lobby, it looks like an ATM machine, and you got to put in your license, and it spits out a pre-populated name badge for you and your picture that comes off of your ID. Well, we asked once when we got into the office, what was, talk to us more about that. And they said, well, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but it's doing a background check on you. And if it doesn't spit out a name tag, I know not to let you in the building. Because there's some indication in your background that you might not be a safe adult to be in this building. Regardless if it's that or it's a sign in, sign out, or show us your ID in the office or something like that. And we should have some type of system for that in place. We should have badges that adults, are wearing in the building that identify them as being okay to be in the building, things like that. So those are some things we can do for physical security purposes. I know the biggies like metal detectors and cameras are go-to kind of things, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be there, but they're more surfacey than they are really substantive. They give the appearance of safety versus actual security. So there's a number of things that contribute to physical safety. There's a number of things that contribute to psychological safety. In terms of, we talked about training adults earlier. Now we're talking about empowering kids. This is where we're doing some education with kiddos themselves. What to do in terms of recognizing potential threats or violence, and what to do with information when they have it. So you see here empowering students by involving them, and this is especially important for adolescents. You want to teach the difference between snitching and seeking help. You think about development, especially with tweens and teens, they're primarily focused on their peers, and they don't want to stand out, and they don't want to look like they're tattling or narcs or anything like that. This also applies to the bullying stuff. I don't know what's happening locally, but in Minnesota, we're required not only to do anti-bullying education, but bystander education. And even though this bystander education is evidence-informed and been shown to potentially be effective, with teens, they've noticed the research has been showing that a lot of teens have been reluctant, even though they know what they're supposed to do when they observe something, they've been reluctant to do anything with it because, again, that developmental stage they're in, they don't want to stand out from their peers or appear that though they're narking on their peers. So I'm not saying we should eschew the education piece. We should still empower kids in this process, but realize that education alone isn't adequate. And again, this is why I've been stressing so much throughout about this notion of relationships. Education's one piece of the puzzle. Relationships are another big important piece of this puzzle. If kids and adolescents feel connected and feel safe reaching out to trusted adults with information, that is predicated on a relationship. So this is why it's important to make sure that we've got good relationships going on. This is why it's important that adults are, as people are coming into school, they're welcoming them and inducting them into the building. This is why during all transitions we've got adults moving throughout hallways and other places and interacting with students. It's not, teachers shouldn't just be at their doors having coffee talking to one another. They need to be actively engaged with students and other adults moving through the building. Again, this heightens relationship building and the potential that they'll be seen as trusted adults and students will go to them if they have concerns. And then ensuring, again, that's what I was just stressing here with the caring adult connections. Now you see down here this video, The Path to Violence. If this were the 3-hour workshop, I would be showing about a half-hour snippet from it, but I would highly encourage all of you, if you're not familiar with this video, to check it out. And You know, I think I checked a few months ago, I think it might be available as an open source document. If not, you could either access it through Netflix somehow or Amazon, or if you still have a DVD player, you could still get it that way. But it looks at a number, it's about 3 years old now, but it looked at a number of school shootings that had taken place to that point. And they're interviewing law enforcement and FBI people and researchers and scrutinizing these school shootings and why things went unreported, or how do they get to the point where the actual violence could be carried out. And they said, they keep stressing time and time and time again, it's not metal detectors, it's not necessarily taking away guns, it's relationships were the #1 preventative factor for violence. And it was relationships between adults and kids. The FBI is saying this, the Secret Service is saying this, the law enforcement people represented in this video are saying this, and the researchers and the experts on this all say this #1 preventative factor for violence is relationships. So that's where we should be emphasizing things first, and of course putting all those other measures in place too. So in terms of being aware of risk factors and warning signs, so there is a distinction between risk factors and warning signs. Risk factors are clues that somebody perhaps could be more prone, in this case, towards violence. This is often associated as well with suicide risk. So there's risk versus warning. So risk are some of those things that might put somebody more at risk for making violent statements or following through on violence, versus warning signs, which indicate that someone has, they've actually put out there, they're already going down this road. Risk factors, the potential. Warning signs, something's been put out there, it might be going down that road. So, so risk factors are variables that increase the probability of a student being violent. It signals the need to be vigilant, not necessarily predictive, but vigilant. And it includes verbalizations, behaviors, emotions, and physical presentations. So some potential examples of risk factors include socially withdrawn or isolated kids. Again, what's this emphasizing? Relationships are important. Victim of people who've been victims of bullying or violence or that types of things, and victims of abuse at home, physical, emotional, sexual, or otherwise, and individuals lacking empathy. These people might stand out on our radar screens as those who might potentially put out violent statements or maybe go down a road towards violence, all right? So, again, relationships are uber important. Warning signs indicate imminent risk of harming oneself, harming others, or destroying property. In isolation, they should be of concern, but when combined with risk factors, they should be especially worrisome, okay? So some examples include, and I'm not trying to go down a road with, gun stuff, but the research has shown that somebody who's got access to weapons and uses them, a need for revenge, those who demonstrate serious fighting with peers or family members, those who engage in severe destruction of property, those with severe rage for seemingly minor reasons, anger control issues, detailed threats of lethal violence, violent postings on social media sites, and suicidal ideation and behaviors. These are all indicators these are all warning signs that somebody's on the path towards violence, all right? Combine those with risk factors, our antennae should be just going crazy, all right? So this notion of this myth, he in quotes, just snapped. So I'll read this for the benefit of everyone who may not be able to see this. Our research and other studies have consistently shown that mass murderers, whether adolescents or adults, will research, plan, and prepare for their act of targeted violence over the course of days, weeks, and even months. In fact, the fantasy of committing a mass murder may have incubated in the mind of the subject for years, even though the time, place, and target of the killings has yet to be determined by him. And the reason they're focused on male pronouns here is that the research has shown that most violence has been carried out by men, though girls are increasingly engaging in violence. But historically, the more violent forms have been conducted by boys or men. So what stands out to you as you listen to that quote and think about the notion he just snapped? The data indicate that roughly 80% of people who have committed violence had put it out there before. That they said it, they verbalized it, they posted it somehow. They want to get caught. They want somebody to step in and stop this. 80% of the time, these have been put out there prior to the violence occurring. So in most cases, prior to violence occurring, the perpetrator has put it out there in some way, shape, or form. This has been fermenting for days, weeks, or months. In most cases, this just doesn't happen out of the blue. Somebody just doesn't snap. Okay? That's very important for us to know. Again, we want to teach adults what to look for, we want to teach kids what to be aware of, and we need reporting mechanisms in place because hopefully, in the vast majority of instances, we can prevent it from even getting to the point where something's carried out. We can get information, get data, develop a plan, and get this from stopping this before it gets beyond a certain point. All right, so here on the screen, you're going to see the pathway towards violence, and you see that at your far left, pathway, fixation, identification behavior, novel aggression behavior, last resort behavior, energy boost, leakage, direct threat communication. The research has shown that this is a pathway to violence, and the earlier in this pathway you can interrupt it, the greater the chance you will prevent it from moving any further. We want to prevent things from happening in the first place, but the earlier in this pathway that we can intervene, the greater our chances are of preventing from getting, the violence actually being carried out. And again, this is important why people need to be aware of all of these signs so that they can report them and we can intervene earlier on. All right? So, some steps for schools in this process. Just to make you aware, the courts have recognized that no school personnel can predict the future. It's that if we all had those crystal balls, that would be beautiful, but the courts have recognized that that's not possible and that we can't completely control a student's behavior. However, courts have asserted that schools must make good faith efforts to prevent acts of violence from occurring, to be as preventative as possible, prepared in those instances where we can't prevent things from happening, and being able to respond when accordingly as necessary. Thus, schools in this process need to establish policy and authority, establish teams and a process, and create a reporting mechanism so that people know where to go with information when they have it. Okay? So, with establishing policy and authority. So, it demonstrates that you're taking this seriously and that there's a commitment to establishing a threat assessment protocol and process. Process fidelity and outcomes are dependent on the quality of staff training and a system that focuses on accountability, that emphasizes that notion of training we talked about earlier, and develop a protocol for who will do what. So again, this is why the team process is important and that the responsibility of those team members is known and that they each have a role to play in this process. So in terms of the team itself, establishing the team, it must be multidisciplinary. Again, this should not rest on any one person's shoulders. Sometimes historically, this has been left primarily in an administrator's hands. And what's the role? There's multiple roles to administrator. But when you think about this particular issue, what's been the primary role of an administrator? It's been more from a disciplinary perspective. And that's an important role, but it shouldn't be the only role. This is why we need multiple roles represented, gathering information, interpreting that information as a team, and making effective decisions from there. So in terms of who should be on this team, of course, we should have an administrator present. I would say, and the literature would support, we need a school-based mental health professional, and I'm going to lean in the direction of a school psychologist. But of course, school social workers, school counselors, or others can certainly be involved. And then we probably want to have a general ed teacher, a SPED teacher. It's important to have a SPED teacher represented because if this is a kid who comes forward who's also got a SPED label or is receiving SPED services, we want to make sure that this isn't a manifestation of their disability and that we need that perspective there. And then an SRO might be appropriate, but not automatic. if there is potentially a threat's been made and potentially there's a crime beneath it, we might want that representation. But it doesn't mean that an SRO is an automatic part of the team if it's a mental health issue or some other reason. But the team can expand and contract as appropriate or as necessary. And there's training that needs to be involved for people to participate on these teams. So again, the thing I'm emphasizing here is that this is a team process. We need a number of roles represented, and people need to be trained in the behavior threat assessment and management process to participate on the team itself. I will make a statement about the Virginia model, the Dewey-Cornell model. The perspective built into the Cornell model is that the administrator takes the report and takes the lead on this process. The other models don't stipulate that it's the administrator per se. It's somebody on that team. And so I would just invite you to consider a variety of things in terms of identifying who receives the report and who takes the lead on the process. Could be administrator, it could be a school-based mental health person, it could be another person. This is just reinforcing some of what I was just trying to communicate. So the principal is one option in terms of leadership, or the kind of person overseeing the team of the process, but the school-based mental health professional is also another very good option. School psychologists have a wide range of training with behavioral issues, with school climate issues, with other things, good database decision makers, and so on and so forth. And the team leader is the one who receives the initial threat or concerns and activates the threat assessment process. And you see here emphasized under the picture that you should always have 1 to 2 backup team leaders identified. You can't predict when these issues might pop up. And if something comes up today and your team lead, the person who's been identified as the team leader is out of the building or unavailable, you need to make sure that you've got backup for somebody to fill in and step in and fill in that role, okay? So whatever you decide as a team in terms of who's going to serve as your typical leader, you want to make sure that you have 1 to 2 backups identified. And this person also coordinates the process and ensures a collaborative process is at play here. In terms of team meetings, they occur whenever a concerning student or situation is evident, but also on a regular basis to engage discussions and role playing. So the team needs to meet when it receives a report and we decide that we need to put the process in motion. But it's also a best practice that this team meets on a regular basis to update or discuss policy, to update or discuss procedures, and to perhaps do tabletop exercises or role-playing exercises. You can't be prepared for every potential concern that you receive. And even in those situations that are unique, that one may never occur again. So a way to hone your skills and try to be as nimble as possible and be able to react to a number of potential situations that arise, a tabletop exercise or a role-playing exercise is something that these teams could engage in an ongoing process just to keep their skills nimble and keep on top of things as much as possible. And so this, when you're establishing authority and policy around the BTAM process, is that you actually want to establish the process itself. So again, it's an ongoing happening versus a one-time event. And it's more than just threat assessment. So in terms of the general process, it might be a concern is reported, we triage the student or the situation, we assess in some way, shape, or form using multiple methods, interviews, looking at other data, so on and so forth, and developing a management plan as a result. So this is what the general process might look like. All the specifics under each might be unique to building, district to district, place to place. But again, a concern is reported, we go into triage mode, we do some assessment, we develop a plan as a result. So in this process, we want to create a centralized reporting mechanism. Now, again, we want to make sure people know where to go, like what adults to go to in a building when they hear or see a concern. Now, hopefully it would be a primary adult in the classroom, but it could be you, a school-based mental health professional. Some people might go directly to administrator. But whatever adult somebody seeks out, that adult needs to know where to go with the information. So we need to teach kids, they need to seek out trusted adults, and we need to make sure that trusted adults know where to go with the information if they receive it, okay? So making sure that we've got a reporting mechanism in place. And an option is an anonymous reporting system. There are just some kids, for whatever reason, that may not go to adults with information. No judgment, but it just may not happen. It's also been shown to be effective to have an anonymous reporting mechanism in place to get this process going, but then that requires people to monitor that anonymous reporting system. I'm just going to go off script a little bit. So there are some districts out there, like Google Alerts and things like that. You can do Google Alerts, like put in the school name, you can put in specific threats or whatever, and so that anytime something's out there in the cybersphere that includes that school name and a threat of violence, that an alert comes up. But what if that alert comes through at 2 in the morning? Do you have people monitoring this at 2 in the morning? Should you have people monitoring this at 2 in the morning? Well, if you think about a liability perspective, a threat came through at 2 in the morning, but we didn't get to it until later in the day, and maybe somebody followed through. Somebody said you weren't monitoring certain mechanisms that could make schools liable. So whatever system's put in place, it has to be monitored. But the other things that come up from a school perspective is, can you really realistically have staff monitoring things at all hours of the night? And that's off school time. Do they get paid for this? And all this other stuff. So it's tricky. So I just want to make you aware of that even those systems where they've got something like that in place, they might get themselves in trouble later on if it's not constantly monitored, and then you've got labor issues and other things that impact this process. So this requires thoughtful, considerate deliberation when you put these systems into place. And then there are a number of apps and other things that alert systems that are coming into play now. And as you see, this one, Safe to Tell Colorado, that's been one that's been instituted and a kind of go-to model. I don't know if it's perfect or not, but it's one that exists and that has been out there for a little bit and that some people are familiar with. So what the question was, do you have to pay for some of these apps or alert systems or things like that? And I think it depends. Some are fee for service, and these can be cost a lot of bucks. And there might be things out there that are relatively low cost or no cost. But I can't expand on the quality of those that might be low to no cost versus those you're spending bazillions of bucks on. I can't speak to the difference in quality, but yes, some of these are probably costing money and big money at that. All right, so again, you are not leaving here able to go and do this. What you see on the screen right now is the general process. All right, so a report comes through. We need to do some triage. So we need to get access to the student that is perceived as a potential perpetrator or is reported as a potential perpetrator at risk to do this. We need to interview that student themselves. We need to interview others who made the reports if they were known reporters or important adults in that kid's life or peer groups or things like that. We might need to reach out to others and gather some information. Considered structured assessments, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. There are some structured assessment measures out there that can help guide an interview process when it comes to threat assessment. Consider other data. Prior disciplinary actions, other things from a mental health perspective if you have access to information, other things that might be clues in the kid's cumulative file, or other sources of information. Also consider artistic and written material. You think about from schools, if you want to look at this kid's artwork, or maybe some of the written products this kid is engaged in. Do we see themes or trends coming through some of that information? Pool and interpret the data. Develop a behavior management plan as a result of the data, evaluate outcomes and process, and refine the process. So again, this is what the general process would look like. But we could go, each one of these facets could be an hour-long to 2-hour-long workshop, okay? So just be aware that this is the general process. In this process, be aware of bias. And I'm talking about your bias as adults engaging in this process. And you see different forms of bias up here. Confirmation bias, implicit bias, explicit bias, intentional blindness, and intentional blindness. So confirmation bias. Make sure you're not going into this process looking for information or interpreting data to confirm what you already think about a kid. The implicit bias, attitudes or stereotypes that influence one's read of a person or situation. We make assumptions about a person based on things that might not even be explicit to us or conscious to us, but we've been exposed to this through our upbringing, through society, things like that. We have certain perspectives of certain people, and we might use that might come through. It's unconscious, and it might come through in ways we're not even aware of. Explicit bias. Just as it sounds, you have certain perspectives or discriminatory, prejudicial attitudes towards certain people, and that might inform how you go about interpreting the data. And intentional bias, blindness, missing critical details that are in plain sight. Okay? So again, it's very important to make sure that whatever we're doing in schools, we're keeping all this information at the forefront. And it's also particularly important when we're assessing whether a person poses a threat for violence or an intent to carry through on violence and what we're going to do about it. So it says here, what can we do to avoid bias? We must build in discussion of potential bias as a part of this process. You might put it all out there on the table before you actually start engaging in the process itself. Okay, how might these biases come through this process? How do we keep these in check? It still doesn't mean it won't come through, but it hopefully will diminish the impact of the potential bias that might be at play. What about profiles? I talked about this earlier, and the Secret Service and the FBI and law enforcement, all these other reputable places or sources of information have said profiling does not work. And so you want to be very aware of profiling. So many general characteristics of students who make threats are too common to be useful. And if you look at some of the, what the research has shown, that white males, preoccupation with violent movies or video games, problematic family relationships, and many are victims of bullying. Well, how many of you know somebody like this? I mean, if that's the profile we work off of, we're going to miss a lot of other people who might potentially pose or intend to carry out violence. So profiling, we want to make sure that we're not engaged in that. Some legal considerations, and I can't go into each one of these areas, but I invite you, as you continue to become educated in this area, as you become involved in this type of process, that you be aware of a number of legal things that might impact the process. I'll get to the FERPA exception in a moment, but there's notions of duty to warn, civil rights and anti-discrimination laws that apply to this process, foreseeability, negligence, personal immunity, professional immunity, manifestation determination, and First, Fourth, and 14th Amendments. These, the literature is replete with case law that should make us aware that we have to keep all this information in the back of our minds and engaging in this process. I do want to talk briefly about this FERPA exception. So a kid has made a threat, and we're going to go investigate whether this is substantive or transient and what we're going to do about it. There is a FERPA exception about accessing student information without parental permission. Of course, we should be getting that permission as a rule of thumb. But if there has been a threat of violence made, there is a FERPA exception where you can access parts of a child's file. If there is something in a child's file that may help us investigate this process, a documentation of a history of violence or things like that, a school could release that information to the appropriate people without parental permission. Now, this isn't an all access to every portion of that kid's file. It's if there is something in a kid's file that pertains specifically to a threat or to this process that will be helpful information in making a determination, that information can be released. Now, I'm not stating it elegantly, but what I'm trying to do is encourage you to go look into the FERPA exception that applies to violence, all right? But again, we could spend an hour or more on each of these areas. You just need to be aware that all of these areas apply, and you need to become educated in these areas as a part of the BTAM process. As we conclude, some challenges. to be aware of when it comes to this process. Drift from team approach can happen, especially when there's staff member turnover. You want to remain fidelis to the process and not drift from it. Again, so this shouldn't be dependent on people. It should be dependent on a process. So as people do turn over, we need to make sure that we are continuing to keep the team process at the forefront, and we're training everybody on that team to participate. Avoid making categorical predictions about a student's dangerousness or certify that a student is safe to return to school. You never make a firm statement or commitment in those regards. You're saying the data seem to support this, and this is why we took the action we did. You never say the student is 100% safe to come back or whatever, because you can never say that with any certainty. You're relying on the data, making the best predictions you can based on the data, and developing a plan that seems to fit where the data are taking you. In terms of some limitations, it's not a foolproof method. The BTAM process is not foolproof. It's not reliable for incidents of violence motivated by gang involvement, drugs or alcohol, or sexual gratification, and it doesn't provide predictions for future behavior, placement, or eligibility. All right? And that is what I have for you. BTAM in an hour and a half or less. Any comments, questions, or needs from clarification here from folks in the room or Dr. McKinney, anything out there in cyberspace? I'm not seeing anything in the room. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
How long has this research been going on?
Well, in earnest since Columbine, so probably 20 years in the making. Now, it doesn't mean that it wasn't there before, but in earnest since Columbine, 1999. Dr. McKinney, nothing else out there in cyberspace that you're seeing? All right, Dr. Phelps, looks like there's an evaluation for people here.
Yes, but can we give Dr. Savage a round of applause first? Thank you.